It's a real pleasure right now to be joined by someone who I've wanted to speak to for some time and now got the chance to. It's Mr. Mal Fletcher. We're going to talk today about the Metaverse. Now, I know a little bit about it. You obviously know a fair bit more, which is why I've brought you in today. But for those who've never heard of it, perhaps, and are thinking, what on earth is the Metaverse? Can you describe it a little bit for us, Mal?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's not a new idea, though Facebook would love us to believe that it invented it. It's been around in science fiction for decades. It basically means a future, more immersive, more 3D version of the internet built onto what we already have. And it's also aimed at being a unifying application of the entire internet. So drawing together all things digital, from AI to Bitcoin to games, augmented reality, and a whole lot more. And people talk about a single metaverse, Dave, but there's actually several different types of metaverse being developed today. Some of them work on virtual reality. Most people are familiar with that, where a user places themselves into a virtual space using a set of goggles or something. And then there's the type that is driven by augmented reality, which is where there's tech built into, say, a pair of glasses, and it places virtual images and text over what you're looking at in the real world environment. So both of those could be part of the future metaverse, but the bottom line is it's going to change the power of the internet. It's going to multiply the power of the internet in both positive and negative ways.
It always makes me think, as you said, of science fiction films like maybe The Matrix at an extreme end, but more recently a film, Ready Player One, which, I mean, it's not that many years ago that came out. I believe it's based on a book, but it's kind of crazy how this is very much linked to that. Science fiction isn't so fictional anymore in that sense, is it?
No, it's not. And it's interesting that Meta took its name from Metaverse, not the other way around. But of course, Mr. Zuckerberg would like us to believe that he invented the term.
Right.
It was actually in a novel over 20 years ago as Metaverse. So yeah, even that's an old idea reinvented.
Well, there you go. So he's kind of stuck his brand name to that rather than the other way around. That's really interesting, something I didn't realise there. So let's start off then. Let's start off positively, Mal, because I know on the communications you've sent out, you said that there are some real positive aspects to this, some innovation. What are some of the things you think, okay, this is quite a neat thing that's coming into our world? What are the good things of it?
Yeah, well, there are some good things. I mean, as always, Dave, technology is amoral. It's us that have to choose how we use it.
Sure.
Creates a better world or something less desirable. On the plus side, there'll be great benefits to entertainment with fully immersive games, 3D movies, and so on. And I think the metaverse will add a whole new level to our capacity for innovation through mass collaboration. People already, with today's version of the internet, work online, don't they, over the entire globe, solving problems together. That will be much more possible with the metaverse. Imagine too the impact it could have on education, where children are able to visit simulations of historic events in 3 dimensions. Trainee doctors could perform virtual 3D operations. Architects and engineers could construct almost any lifelike model of their designs. And as it becomes more sophisticated, the metaverse will cut down carbon emissions because people won't need to fly to things like business conferences as much as they do today, especially when they have the holographic part of the metaverse starting to kick in. So there are a lot of positives, which is why businesses are spending millions of dollars today to try and get a presence in the metaverse.
What do you see as some of the kind of major pitfalls and challenges and potential risks and dangers here with the metaverse?
Well, Dave, I think the metaverse will almost certainly magnify our problems with data generation. It's difficult to put numbers on these things, but there are some estimates that have the value of the global data economy today at around 3 trillion American dollars. And yet we, who provide the data, get very little by way of direct benefit from its use. So that's not going to go away. That's going to grow as we put more and more data in to drive the metaverse. I think there are challenges too. People are already hearing about assaults, including quite violent assaults in the nascent metaverse, including sexual violence. And all right, the abusers and the victims exist only in avatar form on the metaverse, but for the victim, that does very little to reduce the psychological impact and the feelings of vulnerability that inspires. We have to remember that every avatar represents a human being who's making a choice to behave in that way. So we're going to need to be very, very careful, particularly where very young people and children are concerned. They, of course, legally shouldn't be given access to this, but it doesn't stop
Yeah.
ingenious children from getting access, does it?
Data is one of the things I wanted to pull on a little bit, Mal. So data in terms of security, I imagine, is going to be a big thing as well. And when it comes to our identity and who we are online, what are some of the challenges maybe around that and kind of identity theft and some of those things with the metaverse?
Well, identity theft is a huge problem anyway, Dave. Today, I mean, there are millions of people around the world every day that are affected by ID fraud. I forget the exact number, but it's a very high number of people. And most of these people, it takes months to recuperate simply because ID theft takes away everything. It takes away essentially who you are.
Yeah.
Your reputation is up for grabs. People are carrying on in ways that don't represent you in the online space, but as far as the audience is concerned, it is you.
Yeah, right.
So there's ID theft, and linked to that, of course, is financial fraud, because if someone can steal your identity, it's not that much more difficult to attach that to bank accounts and other things and draw small amounts of money over a large period of time, which are difficult to trace, but still mean that you're deeply out of pocket.
And I imagine the more you put more of yourself online, the more you put out there, as you say, create more data, more of yourself is there. There's kind of potentially, I suppose, more to steal. You're more vulnerable in some ways, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, we fall in love with these cool techs, but we don't really stop to think about who owns the data.
Yeah.
Now, I would say I own my data, but Mark Zuckerberg wouldn't. He owns it as far as he's concerned.
Yeah.
Or any of the other big tech companies. So we get no benefit from the sale or use of our data by those companies. They haven't necessarily used it in ways we would approve of. And I think we've got to give more thought to the fact that someone owns this data and they're going to use it in ways that they see fit, not necessarily ways that represent me.
You said that in some of the test versions of the metaverse, there's been some assaults on people. As you mentioned, virtually speaking, but still has a huge impact on people, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's because the internet too, through the metaverse, is growing more and more three-dimensional. So we have what we call the development of haptic technologies. Now, we already know what it's like to put on a pair of gloves and feel something that isn't really there. We know what it's like to see something that isn't really there and to hear something. But now technologists are working on digitizing the effect of taste and smell, so that eventually we will have haptic technologies that fool all of our senses.
Wow. And
you place that into the environment of the metaverse, and it means that any negative interaction is multiplied many times over. So it's not just voice now, where bullying is concerned, for example. It's everything. It's three dimensions. All senses become involved. And the psychological impact of that, especially on younger people, is incalculable. And that raises, of course, the questions of what big tech companies are going to do to protect people, if they can.
We don't really have that down now with social media, do we? It's fair to say it's one of those things that keeps popping up in the news when it comes to trolls and how social media companies regulate that stuff. We haven't got it sorted yet in terms of what we already have. So how's that going to translate when it comes to the metaverse?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, really. I mean, big tech companies like Meta, and there are others too, claim that they'll be able to protect people in the alternative universe. But if they can't protect people from the unscrupulous, the bullying, or even the violent users of today's relatively static internet, how are they going to regulate the behavior of people in the untamed wild west that is and will be for a while, the metaverse? And governments struggle with this too, first of all, because members of governments often aren't up on the latest technology.
Yeah.
And if any of the listeners have ever watched one of those government committees interviewing Mark Zuckerberg or one of the other big tech aficionados,
sure,
they'll know that the members of those committees usually don't know the most basic things about the technology they're investigating. That's part of the problem. But also part of the problem is the global nature of these technologies and these companies. And so we've got Britain now, which is this year instituting, it's already started the process of instituting this regulatory system that becomes the toughest in the world. But of course, policing that once it's instituted is another matter, and I think it will take time to get it right.
It's a big question, and you probably don't have the answer to it. But when it comes to these things, who's going to have the jurisdiction over those kind of things in terms of security and that type of aspect on the metaverse?
Well, eventually, I guess, we will see the emergence of international, even global networks that will have some area of I wouldn't say control, but some area of regulatory power
Mm.
delegated to them by national governments. But in an ideal world, it's national governments representing immediately the democratic voters of those governments who are responsible and who are able to carry it through. I think governments have to try better. I don't think they'll get it right first time, and hats off to the British government at the moment for at least trying.
Sure.
I think they have to try and not just pass the buck and say, well, it's too difficult for us, because this thing is, it will encompass all of life. It will encompass real estate. It will encompass business. People are going to buy land that doesn't exist, land in the virtual world, which is worth real money, albeit in digital form.
Wow.
These things have to be regulated.
Obviously, when you're in this world, you'll be buying things, selling things, so finance is going to come into it. What are some of the maybe challenges when it comes to finance in Metaverse?
Yeah, well, if you're in the virtual reality aspect of Metaverse that we discussed, you will be able to buy and sell virtual products with the exclusive use of weightless digital money. And already we see our obsession with cashless payment systems in the real world is creating challenges with data collection. Big tech companies, banks, businesses, they all recognize that data is the currency of the surveillance economy.
Yeah.
That's why big tech groups are trying to develop their own alternatives to Bitcoin. It's about data, it's not about altruism. And studies have shown, Dave, that people will spend up to 30% more when using cashless payment systems than cash. Now,
Wow.
Cashless is very convenient. I use it all the time myself, but cash has weight. You can actually feel it leaving your pocket. So cashless systems encourage people to spend more with less forethought. And that's why we have a growing problem today with what I call digital debt. It's why we have more and more debt relief charities arising in this country alone.
Yeah.
And Metaverse, I think, will add to that problem unless we're very careful, because it is the exclusive territory of virtual money, digital money. That's not to say I'm against digital money. It's just that we need to recognize that we are likely to spend more when it has no weight and when it has no substance to it.
Yeah. It's really interesting you say that, because I know that people who are involved in CAP, Christians Against Poverty, other debt relief charities as well, they say one of the first things that they kind of recommend to people who are in debt is when it comes to budgeting, particularly say you're going out for a weekend or whatever, take the money that you enable yourself to spend, or you know is within your limits, in cash, because then, as you say, you know physically how much you've got. It's easier to keep to that limit than it is if you're spending cashless. So totally understand what you're saying there. Also, I want to ask you, Mal, a little bit about the kind of access to money, because obviously this sounds to me like, well, obviously there's a lot of tech involved in kind of getting into it. If so much of the world is going to head this way and sort of be on these virtual platforms, augmented platforms, is there a challenge to how some people access it if they're maybe not coming from such a wealthy footing to start off with?
How they access the internet, or how they access money, or both?
Well, how they access the metaverse in the first place, because it sounds as though, it's not necessarily, you don't just wake up one morning and you can go and do it. You're going to need a fair bit of stuff to get involved, I'd have thought.
No, it's true. And I was doing some interviews on this late last year, the Techno Kings, as we call them, the Elon Musks and others that are, in some cases doing wonderful work as heads of big tech companies. They talk a lot about promoting, equality across the globe, equality of opportunity and outcome across the globe. But at the end of the day, as I said earlier, their ultimate goal is to acquire data that they can use in generating new technologies, yes, but also in marketing and selling products. So the Techno Kings talk a lot about equality, but they also generate globally some very big new gaps of opportunity. And one of them is the one you cited there, access to the internet. There are still large numbers of people, especially in underdeveloped nations, that have little or no access to high-speed internet. They might have some internet access, but not high-speed broadband, which of course is required if you're going to run something as holistic and huge as a metaverse. In Africa today, there are huge numbers of people in countries like Kenya, especially in rural areas, that access banks only through old school phones using new school technology. And some very good social enterprises drive that. We're thankful for that. But those people would not have access at this present time or anytime soon to the high speed type of broadband, fiber broadband. You need to get an adequate service on the metaverse? So that's an important question.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some real challenges with that aspect of life, of cashless life, isn't there? In terms of people who find themselves maybe homeless or find themselves in financial trouble. Getting access to finance when you can't get access to cash is kind of difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I'm a big advocate, and have been for more than a decade, of people using cash in sections of their life. So you might not use it all the time, but I keep cash in my wallet and in my passport. I keep cash for wherever I am traveling, because not only is it important for me to feel I have this stuff with me, and by the way, cash doesn't carry any personal information. So no one can steal your ID by stealing your cash.
Yeah.
But they can do that with your phone.
Yeah.
Right. So there's the added advantage there. But it's also important, not only for me carrying cash, it's important that I'm showing vendors, I'm showing merchants, I'm showing others that this is actually important to us as human beings. We want to keep cash. You might primarily accept cashless only in your store, but we want you to know that we still value cash and we require you to use it. And if you won't use it, we'll take our custom somewhere else.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. Well, Mal, it's been a real pleasure to speak to you. We covered a lot of ground. It's a big subject area, looking at Metaverse. I've no doubt we'll probably talk about this more in future as developments come out, as more announcements come out from some of these big tech companies. But for now, Mal, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure, Dave. Good to be with you.